In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the Toronto Argonauts draft preview edition of the X's and Argos podcast, brought to you by Funny Bone Broth. My name is Ben Grant. I'm joined as always by JB. JB, it is CFL draft time. It's also NFL draft time. It's a crazy time of year for Canadian football fans and probably for CFL GMs. The first thing I wanted to talk about on today's episode is how the CFL draft is so incredibly different from every other draft in every other sport in every other league. And most of that is because of the fact that you have players that may be or may not be drafted or signed by the NFL. How difficult does it make the preparation process for general managers in the CFL?
Well, it's such a unusual arrangement because the very best players are available, but are likely never coming to the CFL. So you're definitely in a position where you have to decide risk and reward, where you want the rights to a player, but is that player ever going to come? It's a delicate balance. So it is unusual that way, that you don't get to pick the best player, you get the best player who will come.
And I mean, you could pick the best player. So guys like Chuba Hubbard obviously is going to get drafted, Josh Palmer as well. There's a few other guys I think we expect to go. Javon Holland will obviously go early in the NFL draft. But it's not inconceivable that one of those guys ends up in the CFL. Like, you wouldn't think guys like Bishop Sankey would end up in the NFL. And yet, if he were a Canadian guy and had been drafted, that would be a huge score for a team coming up here. I'm cheering for all of our Canadians who get drafted in the NFL for them to succeed in that league. But there's always the possibility they don't. And then what about guys that are on the fringe? Like, I have such a hard time quantifying how far, just kind of figuring out how far back that puts you. So, like, how far back do you draft Chuba Hubbard, Josh Palmer, Javon Holland?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think that I would maybe spend a last pick on one of them. I don't think it's they're not coming. I really don't think. I think that their level of talent, even if they're not successful where they're drafted, they're going to be practice squad. There are going to be other teams to give them a shot. You have to wash out of the CFL or the NFL, sorry, to end up coming to the CFL. I just don't see that for at least 5 years. I would take one shot with my last pick, but nothing else.
Because the CFL is filled with former NFL draft picks. There are first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh rounders all over the CFL. Guys who everybody thought, and now these are largely Americans, but there are some Canadians as well that everyone thought they would make it, they would have a chance. And, here they are back in the CFL. And so if you gambled and took a draft pick on a guy like that, then that's a huge score. But I think you're right. Like, my way of looking at it is I don't want to gamble too much in those early rounds. So I think, taking a flyer on it in the fifth round and the sixth round, I can deal with that, because I think at that point in the draft, you're not generally looking at pages and pages full of difference makers in the CFL. And so you may as well take a gamble. But I'm not going to spend one of my first 4 picks on a futures guy unless I'm talking about a guy that, maybe is going back to school for one more year or something like that. I'm okay with that. But on a guy that I think is going to get at least the run of a first contract in the NFL, I'm not going to spend a first through fourth round pick on a guy like that. And I think teams will, because you see it every year where a team just takes a gamble at it. You never know, a stab in the dark, maybe they'll end up here and we'll get a big score out of it. So the other thing you have to factor in preparing for this draft is what your philosophy is going to be, because we're drafting all Canadian players. You know that as it stands at the moment, you've got to have 7 Canadians on the field between your offensive and defensive units. And so in addressing those positions, these Canadians are very important. So can you still draft BPA, the best player available, or do you have to think about where you're drafting your Canadians? Are you targeting specific positional groups? I'd like to hear your answer on this, and then I'll give you my own thought on it. BPA or positional group based team needs?
Not to equivocate, but a bit of both. On the whole, I'm best player available. I think that you never want to leave a player who has more talent on the board and not worry about having too much depth at a particular position. If it's a tiebreaker between two, you look towards positional, but best player available would be my guiding light. Talent above all. Stack talent and figure it out later.
See, for me, that's my instinct. I like best player available in the NFL draft. In the CFL draft, because you're dealing with different types of players, because you've got Canadians, Americans, globals, then I do think you have to factor that in. And BPA doesn't always work. This is an extreme example, but like suppose Hamilton's got the first overall pick. Suppose their draft consensus was that a Canadian quarterback was the most talented player in the draft. Now, that's not the case this year, but it never is. But suppose it were this year. There's no chance Hamilton's going to spend that pick on a quarterback. It's just not conducive to success. They've got multiple quarterbacks who can already compete and bring the team success. So in a case like that, or if you've got a stacked linebacking core and you've got a linebacker ranked number one, and you've got your Canadians in place, like I think looking at the Argonauts this year, I'm not saying that linebacker is not a possibility. I think there are a couple of linebackers that the Argos may be tempted to draft, but they've got two great Canadian linebackers. They've got two great backup Canadian linebackers. Maybe there's a position like defensive back where they might have a greater need because they just don't have that many starting level Canadian defensive backs on their roster. So it is a tougher thing for me. I go against my instinct here for BPA because I have to try and find ways to get Canadians on the field, especially in positions where you don't typically find them, those ratio breakers. And if you can find those, I think that sometimes outweighs best player available.
That is very much a CFL specific dynamic. Philosophically, I'm best player available, but the use of Canadians and the ratios complicates it for sure. There is kind of a matrix that is more complicated than NFL has to deal with. So I agree with you that it isn't as easy as best player available.
So I finally finished up the X's and Argos big board, which wasn't... It wasn't, in all honesty, was not as much fun to create this year as last year. And there are a couple of reasons for that. It was much more difficult because we didn't have a U Sports season. And so many of the players are U Sports athletes. And so I found myself having to rewatch games that I already spent weeks and weeks watching last year in evaluating the guys from last year. But to make it more difficult, I'm now watching for juniors, 2019 juniors, guys that weren't the first option, guys that were playing behind the kids that were drafted last year. And so seeing these games again and having to wait sometimes, wading through play after play where they're not even on the field, and then suddenly they get a snap or two in relief of someone else, it just wasn't as easy, and it wasn't quite as enjoyable as the process was last year, just because it was the exact same film. With the Americans, or the Canadians competing in American schools, NCAA schools, that was different, and I got to see some 2020 film, obviously, of those guys, but it was a bit of a grind. So I ended up evaluating 108 players overall. I didn't end up putting all of them on the big board, but you should get a sense, at least from there, as to what I thought of it. But there are always going to be flaws. Last year, I thought I made some really nice hits. I talked about Jack Cassar. I'd talked about Dejan Brissett. I had talked about Sam Achampong as guys that the Argos might draft, and they did. But I also had Theron Churchill ranked as like a 5th or 6th round grade and the Argos ended up picking him with their second pick in the first round. So, I'm all over the place at the end of the day. It's a really difficult thing to do. I did my best with it, but I'm not like a CFL GM spending all year round talking to coaches, watching these guys. For most of these players, I would have watched 2 games, and the way I grouped them together was simply there's 8 players I was evaluating on Calgary, 6 players I was evaluating on UBC. Well, great. Those are 2 games that I can now watch and eliminate those 14 players all at once. And similar with like 6 players in Bishops, 8 players in Laval, and that minimized the amount of film. But the problem with my system is that if you just have an off game, or if you're injured for that game, or sometimes the weather would affect play, then I'm really not getting a fair look at these prospects. So my big board isn't perfect. It was the best I could do, and at this point, I've now run out of time, so I'm going with what I've got. How's that for a sales pitch?
Well, let me first of all commend you. What you have done is a tremendous amount of work. As someone who observed all of the film, a lot of it terrible film, hard to see. Your evaluations and the work you've put in, I hope that all of our listeners and our readers really appreciate how much work went into that. So, I would say hats off to you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's a work in progress too. Like I've kind of fiddled around with the grading system, and I'm not fully happy with it, but I was far more reliant on film than usual this year, because I just didn't have that much knowledge of the players other than some of the OUA guys that we know.
Dipping my toes into a bit of the film definitely reminded me of the American coaches' disdain for our handheld sideline film, and them looking at us like we were country bumpkins who had fallen off the wagon to play some football. A lot of that film is not pristine NCAA quality.
A lot of it is not, and it depends on the feed that you get, and what access I could get to various different film. But yeah, some of it is TV coverage quality. Some of it is your all 24s that are taken by the teams, or occasionally by a parent. Something like that, and you've got a shaky camera, you're from miles away. There's so much of it that still, in this day and age, boggles my mind that it's not in HD. I really went crazy. I was in the middle of watching a Bishops game. I can't remember who they were playing, and it was in like 480p, and it was raining, and I could barely even see the numbers, and I was like, what's going on here?
It really is, on a separate point, not that I need to get on a high horse here, but it is outrageous that the CIS, especially as more Canadian players are piquing the interest of NFL scouts and certainly for the CFL teams, it is outrageous that there is not a standardized quality of all 24 film in the CIS for football. I mean, that just has to happen.
And it's got to be a matter of time. Like I would love, because we don't even have, even with the CFL coverage, like it's great that TSN picks up every game. I would love to have access to all 24 after every game. I'd love to have end zone and sideline and film cut up and available, and all games there on YouTube done in that style. And I'd love it for CIS too. Or U Sports, as I still have trouble remembering to call them.
Yeah, the CFL should release their all 24 film.
I would love that, but I think we're in the minority. I don't know how many people would subscribe to that. The way that you see the numbers, obviously in the NFL, I'm not sure you would get that. So they obviously don't feel it would be worth their while.
No, it's true. There is a dearth of CFL tape heads where there are a million American college, high school, NFL websites, scouts who are breaking down film and looking at things, and it is a gap. I would love to see there be more Canadian analysis, and if they, if you build it, they will come. If they start releasing all 24 film, maybe you could start to build something.
So let's talk about the actual draft. I was leaning heavily towards defensive backs, and I found myself paying more attention in my evaluation to defensive backs because to me, as somebody who covers the Argos, that's a position that I really feel we need more of a Canadian presence. I think we've got a really nice core of Canadian offensive linemen. I think you can never have too many, and there's a few I have my eye on in this draft too. But we do have a shortage positionally of Canadian defensive backs. I think you can always use an extra couple of receivers here and there. But all in all, I feel pretty good about where the team is. So I tended to find that, yeah, that was where I was leaning every time I did an evaluation. And so in the first round, there are two defensive backs in particular that I'm just praying are still available when our pick comes around. I think one of them will be, and I think one of them won't be. The guy I really want is Nelson Lacombo out of Saskatchewan. He's ranked on my board ahead of a lot of these guys that I know are going to spend a few years down in the NFL, but I just loved his tape. Everything about it I thought was fantastic.
I'm obviously a fan of his brother. He is a fantastic package. I mean, he can play in the box. He has terrific explosion. He reads the game really well. He's instinctive to picking up run or pass. He tackles with authority. He can play in space, which is a nice combo for somebody who is so great in the box. I agree. I think his film is terrific, and I think especially at the beginning of his career, if you give him, he was sort of Mr. Everything for Saskatchewan. I mean, if you give him a sort of a smaller responsibility load, my gosh, what could he do if you say, we just need you to do this, one down a game, as he gets into it? I think he could be devastating.
Yeah, no, I think he's going to be an excellent CFL player for a long time. You just watch him move so effortlessly. Everything just looks so fluid. Everything he does looks so easy. And he looks even faster than his 4.6 on film, which is a really nice time, but he moves even quicker than that.
I think he's there for us in our first round.
I think he may end up going 3, 4, somewhere in there.
Really? That high, eh?
I do. I really think he's going to. Just the more I watched him, the more I fell in love with it. And just knowing how much film these general managers are watching, I just can't see them looking at him and not thinking, man, this is a guy that would look fantastic in our colors.
Do you feel that maybe some worry that he's a bit of a tweener?
I think with a lot of these guys, he's not one that I don't know. Like I think you could even, because I could even see him playing in that cover backer spot too, because I think he's going to be able to add a little bit of weight. That
was sort of my initial thought, is that more that than a straight DB.
And he's someone too that there's marked improvement in over the years. Like you really see in his film the calculations that he's making as he's recognizing route concepts. And I think that's one of the reasons that he seems to break so quickly on the ball, is that he knows what's coming before it's happening. And that speaks to the film that he's obviously watching, the route, the repetition that he's getting, and just playing more and more football. I think the more you watch, the more tape you watch of him, the more you fall in love with him. So yeah, if he's there in the first round for the Argos,
let's go make it happen, Argos.
The other guy, so if Lacombo isn't there in the first round, I think the other guy that I want in the first round is a little bit of a different kind of gamble, and that's Patrice Rene, a defensive back who's been playing at North Carolina and has just transferred to Rutgers. So the story on him is that he won't be here in 2021. He's committed to play at Rutgers for this next football season. So you're going to be at least a year, and it could be more, before you end up seeing him up here, depending on what kind of NFL interest he has. He is an NFL level corner. I think the NFL is going to ultimately pass on him because they're very discriminatory in terms of age. And he's a player that has spent 5 years now at North Carolina. He was granted a red shirt in there, and so he's going to play now for Rutgers. And he's going to be coming out of there much older than most of the other prospects that are looked at. And I just think, especially now being at Rutgers as opposed to North Carolina, I think that carries some weight to it as well. So I just don't know if he's going to get picked up by the NFL, and his play had dropped off a little bit this year. He had a wonderful season 2 years ago, or in 2018. 2019, he dealt with an injury and just wasn't the same, and it just looked like he was a shadow of his former self this year. So if he gets it back together at Rutgers next year, maybe he plays himself into the NFL picture, but I think it's a long shot at this point. And I think he's a corner that can play anywhere in the secondary. He's got safety experience. He can play corner really well. And what an asset that would be to have a Canadian DB who you can put anywhere in that defensive backfield. So I think it's worth a gamble, even though you've got to wait a year. Because with most of these guys, you're waiting a year anyway. Most of these guys need a year to learn the ropes before they get on the field. So if he spends that year playing football at Rutgers, great.
But a first round pick?
Well, we look at our first round picks. You would ideally, like a guy like Dejan Brissett, I think could have come on the field last year right away. You don't often see guys get in there right away and start. Like, I don't think, had there been a season last year, I don't know if we would have seen Theron Churchill out there. I don't think we would have seen Jack Cassar out there. These are first and second round guys that probably weren't going to be on the field. It just takes that extra bit of time. It is a very different process, the CFL draft, in terms of these guys being ready to contribute and step on the field. It's not quite the same as it is with the NFL draft. Not for everybody. You would hope that the top 5 guys in the draft could do that. And like I said, I think Dejan Brissett could have. But I'm okay. I'm okay spending a first round pick on a guy that going forward can be a real winner on this team.
I mean, Rutgers brought back Greg Schiano, and while maybe he's not the most popular coach in the world for a lot of people, he clearly is an NFL quality coach and is well respected by the NFL, coaching community. So I think there's a great opportunity for him to add a lot of knowledge in that 1 year.
The second round for me gets easier. There's a bunch of guys that I'm really interested in, and I'm positive one of them is going to be there in the second round. And I've got them all graded in a very similar group, I suppose. Alaric Johnson probably won't be there. He's the tackle out of Iowa. And I know that like the Canadian Scouting Bureau had him, I think they had him ranked second overall. He was first for most of the year, and I think they ended up with him in second. And so if the other CFL GMs, if they think that Alaric Jackson is as good as the Canadian Scouting Bureau does, then he's not going to make it to the second round. I don't think he's worthy of a first round pick. That said, I think he is a really good player. And if he's there in the second round, I think absolutely you take any offensive lineman out of Iowa. Now, there is a risk that the NFL is going to draft him. I wouldn't be surprised to see Alaric Jackson end up in the CFL, even though there's a chance he may be a late round NFL pick, and he'll certainly be a camp pickup. I still think that's a gamble I don't mind taking. I don't want to take a guy like Chuba Hubbard, like Josh Palmer, Javon Holland, but I think I would gamble on Alaric Jackson if he's there in the second. Other guys I like, Terrell Jana, the receiver out of Virginia. I think he'll be there. And he's also a coin flip as to his NFL status. Dean Leonard, defensive back out of Mississippi, I don't think is going to be drafted in the NFL. We'll see. But if he makes it to the second round, and he just might, we've got an early pick in the second round because it is going in the sort of snake style draft that so many of our fantasy drafts follow. And so, he's in most boards ranked somewhere between 10 and 20. So he may be there for us in the second round. So I think that would be a great pick, Dean Leonard. Sage Dockstader is another one that I like, offensive lineman from New Mexico State who has 5 years of playing tackle at New Mexico State. He's just a giant human being that simply doesn't get knocked back off his feet. He's got really quick feet for his size. Not a great run blocker, but again, I don't think that's a huge problem in the CFL. His pass blocking is great. He mirrors really well, uses his hands well. I would definitely take him in the second round if none of those other guys I previously mentioned were there. I think Sage Dockstader is going to be a great CFL lineman. And the last guy that I would look at in the second round is offensive lineman Liam Dobson out of Maine. Just a very natural pass blocker, very similarly, not necessarily the best run blocker in the world, but is pass blocking just looks so effortless for him. Another guy that's got really good feet for his size. He's mostly played at right tackle, but I think he would probably be a guard in the CFL. I think that's probably what his future is as a guard. And I think he'd be a pretty dominant guard in pass protection. Maybe give him a year or two to settle in. I think he'd be ready to go. So those are all guys I'm hoping are there in the second round. And like I said, the chances of none of them being left, I think, are slim. So if we could pick up either Lacombo or Rene in that first round and one of those guys in the second, I think we are off to a flying start.
I really loved DB/linebacker coming out of Montreal, Cramdy.
Oh, yeah. He's exciting.
I love his closing speed. I love his explosiveness. Like, even though he's down, is not going to be, a first couple of round pick. Feels like his explosion and his speed is elite.
Yeah, Rena Cramdy's a lot of fun to watch. I know the CFP guys are really high on him. I think they had him ranked 21. I think I have him. I think I have him down at 40 on my board. But yeah, I really like him too. I think he's got that great explosion. And I think he does look. What did he end up? He ended up running a 4.7, 4.6, 4.7. I think 4.7 at about 200 pounds, 5'11, and he looks at least that fast on film. I think he.
Yeah, plays faster than that.
Yeah,
on film.
He closes like lightning. You see that recognition in him. This light goes on. And I love him getting after the quarterback, too. You see him sometimes where he's fanning out into his zone and the quarterback starts rolling. And then Cramdy just turns it on and decides, like, okay, I'm going. And just like snap of the finger, he's on top of the quarterback. So, yeah, he's good. There's a reason that CFP has him ranked so high. He's very exciting.
Yeah, he just screams special team ace.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, he would do really well. He wouldn't look remotely out of place on a CFL roster. So yeah, I'd love to see a guy like that. I think that would be more of for me, it would be more of a third or fourth round target, and I'm not sure he's going to get that far. I wouldn't be surprised if he actually gets picked up by the Alouettes in the second or third round even.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, if he's still there later, absolutely. Some of the guys that I like for the third round, the guy that I'm most high on in this whole draft, I think he's probably going to go round 3 or 4. Félix Garand-Gauthier out of Laval. He's a fullback. This guy is a football player, and it's not a position of need for us. We've got Declan Cross, we've got Dion Pellerin, and there are some other good, tight ends / fullbacks in the draft. The two guys, Bruno Labelle from Cincinnati, Jake Burt from Boston College. But I absolutely love Félix Garand-Gauthier. You watch him play, and they kind of use him at Laval. They used him a lot as a slot back, third receiver. And he would come across and kick out the defensive end on the other side. And he is just like a tank, an absolute bulldozer. There's absolutely no loss of momentum when he goes into a block. 6'1", 221, 17 reps on the bench. He runs almost 5 seconds flat for his 40. Good speed for a guy that size. And he's just one of those guys that has that magical ability to inflict more damage in a hit than everybody else. I don't know what it is. It's the explosion in his hips or whatever it is, but when he hits someone, they go flying. And I would love to see him out there, probably mostly on special teams, but I think you definitely give Dion Pellerin a run positionally. And I just think you can't have too many guys like that on your football team. So I would love to see them take a shot at Félix Garand-Gauthier in the third round.
No, I'm just going to say it's not an overwhelming draft in terms of talent, but I do feel that the Argos roster is so different than it was the last time we had a draft talk. There are fewer holes. There are a couple of players here you could plug in, I think, who could really make a difference.
And I think it may just not feel like it's that deep a draft because the film we have on these guys are when they were juniors and they just weren't getting a ton of playing time. Like, it's so hard to gauge.
It's a totally underrated conversation, especially in Canada. The learning curve of football players and how much is gained between junior and senior year. the speed and the recognition and the understanding is an absolute loss for the league and will be something really challenging for these guys to overcome, because there's so much learning that happens in that final year and playing in your senior year in terms of playing for the CFL. I'm really curious to see how it translates, because I think it's going to have a huge impact.
And I think you probably saw in my notes my repeated expression of, man, I wish this guy had a 2020 season, because there's so many guys that just didn't have reps because they were playing behind a terrific player who was drafted last year. They happen to play the same position. You've got it's like 6 linebackers from UBC that are all outstanding, but 3 of them just couldn't get on the field because they had such all-stars lined up in front of them. And so I would love to see what those guys do. So maybe it is a far stronger draft than we're aware, but we just don't have enough evidence of that. Some other guys that I liked in the third, Connor Bergloff, I think what might be an interesting one, and I wouldn't mind having another center on the roster. 6'3", 305 from Saskatchewan. He jumped out on film to me. I loved watching what he could do. And if he's there in the third round, I would absolutely take that guy. Wonderful pass protection. Another guy that, and again, I kind of throw out run blocking to an extent, because I think he's a much better pass protector than he is a run blocker. But that's absolutely fine with me. Protect the quarterback. I don't think you need to run the ball in the CFL. I think if you can pass the ball on every down, great. Let's do that. Run occasionally to just keep them honest. But any lineman that can pass protect is good in my book. And then Christopher Fournier from Lehigh, another offensive lineman who mostly played left tackle down at Lehigh, but he could play anywhere on the line. He's played some center too. Quick feet, moves so effortlessly for a big guy. That's another guy that I would happily take in the third round. And then the last 2 guys I want to talk about, Alain Simakinda, who absolutely ruined my day 3 years ago. I was turning on my TV to watch Guelph, Ottawa. I had a couple former players playing for Ottawa, and Simakinda could not be blocked. He just destroyed Ottawa's offensive line, and sack after sack after sack. And my radar was immediately on for this guy, because as soon as I saw that game, I'm like, this guy's going somewhere. And he's had some up and down games. He would go several games without necessarily being noticeable, but then suddenly he'd pop up and just, again, destroy opposing offensive lines. The problem with him is that I don't know exactly what to do with him at 6'1", 245. I kind of like him on the inside. I feel like that's where he's best, but he's a little bit undersized for a defensive tackle, and there are quite a few tweeners in this draft. So he's someone I would love to draft and then figure that out later. What can we do with him now that he's on the roster? Because I promise it's something. You can do something with that guy. I just don't know exactly what it is. And then the last guy I want to talk about is Dylan St. Pierre from Ottawa, a receiver. I hadn't seen much on him. The name sounded familiar, and I started watching his film, and man, he looks really good. He ran a 4.6. It looks like he ran a 4.6. He moves incredibly fast, and he's got very much that CFL slot back look, but he has the best double move in this entire draft. He did it again and again and again. He would just bait defensive backs into closing and trying to cut off that speed out, and then suddenly he was gone. And that first 2 steps of acceleration are elite. From the brief turn he makes to the outside, a split second later, he's by you and he's in the end zone doing a dance. I think he would be an interesting player, and he's got great size. He plays specials, 6'1", 220. To move like that, I think is definitely a guy that I would want to see on the Argos. So any of those guys in the third round, I would be thrilled. And I'm sure, like I said before, I think at least one of those guys has got to be there.
So as we begin to wrap up our draft talk, is there a late round diamond in the rough you would be really happy to see the Argos snag?
There are a couple out here. I love the guys from Manitoba. I think Shea Weeks probably gets drafted earlier than I would draft him if he makes it into the later rounds. I really like Shea Weeks, but a guy that I noticed while watching Shea Weeks' film was RJ Shelley, a defensive back at Manitoba, 6'4", 195, very fast, runs a 4.7, and he looks excellent on film. And if he can add a little bit of weight, which I really think he can, his frame looks like he could support another 10, 15 pounds easily. So that's a guy that I think would make a really interesting cover backer and a guy that should be available in the later rounds. Another guy I wouldn't mind seeing is a receiver out of York, Luther Hakanovanhu, who just hasn't had much playing time. He's one of those guys I talked about earlier that really could have used a 2020 season. But watching him move around, great size, great speed, such natural hands and an instinct, this ability to high point the ball every time. He would need practice squad time. He's not ready to go right now, but I would love to take a flyer on him late in the draft. And then the last guy I wanted to talk about is Jesse Enns, who I think definitely makes it into the later stages of the draft. He's an offensive lineman from Regina. I remember watching him a bit last year when I was watching Theron Churchill tape. And of course, I had that tape on again this year. He was coming off the bench because he was in for Churchill and in for, I can't remember who was playing left tackle for Regina in those games. But yeah, he played some left tackle, played some right tackle. He looks really good. And with the 2020 season, I think he would have looked highly draftable. He's not quite Theron Churchill. There is a difference in skill, but he's got that same intelligence and he's got that same level of strength. I don't think he quite has the burst that Churchill has, but again, time has gone by. Maybe he does by now. But that's someone in a later round. If you haven't picked up an offensive lineman yet, I'd take a gamble on Jesse Enns. I like those Regina offensive linemen, actually, the more film I watch of them. So I think those would be great late round picks. For anyone hoping to tune into the draft and get some draft coverage, first of all, I want to direct you to all of our content that you can find on xsandargos.com. But on draft night, Tuesday, May the 4th, you can, of course, watch the draft on TSN. But Canadian Football Perspective is going to be doing some live streaming on Twitch, which I think will be a really good show with Wade, Connor, and Marshall. I'm definitely going to check that out. I would encourage you to as well. And if you're not Twitch inclined, then of course the coverage will be there for you on TSN. JB, thanks so much for your insight as always. Anything else to add?
I have a May the 4th joke for you if you wish.
Please.
How did Darth Vader know what Luke bought him for Christmas?
How?
He felt his presence.
That's actually not bad. Well, that will just about do it for us today on the Toronto Argonauts Draft Preview edition of the X's and Argos podcast, a bonus edition. For JB, my name is Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see you.